Hey, it's Chris. I was in a peer support therapy last week, and topic turned to sort of connection to family, and I started to talk about my dad. So I thought, you know what? I've never really put a journal entry down or really ever put my thoughts down about my father, and I thought, why not? I was planning on doing a little more video journaling a few months back, and when I started this channel, but my life got very chaotic. I wasn't able to, so now I'm getting back to it. But yeah, I haven't really thought much about it, and I just thought I would go through from when I was young, kind of thinking about my dad, my first memories of him, and just my thoughts and feelings. Okay, let me think of my very first memory of my father. The first thing I can remember was being camping with him. No, that's not true. Actually, I think it is true. I have this false memory, or some sort of memory, that when I was a very, very tiny child, that I was with my mom and dad somewhere in a dinghy or a raft. That's my first memory. I remember being held by my father. But those are just the faintest, vaguest of memories. In reality, my memories of my father are almost non-existent, and the ones that are there are very scattered. I think it's safe to say I never really had a good bond with my father. I don't know who he is. I never knew who he was. So I remember when I was in kindergarten, I do not remember my father having any involvement in my life. All of my memories of that time are of my mother, taking me to school, caring for me at home, when my brother was at kindergarten and I wasn't. I remember when I was really, really young, maybe I was in preschool, or maybe I was 3, or I don't even know, probably like 3 and a half, 4, something like that. My dad was in Resolute Bay. Something to do with his job. He took an optional position in Resolute Bay to earn a little extra money, so he was away from the family for 6 months, so we never saw him then, so he wasn't part of my early childhood for 6 months there. I remember when he came back, it felt like a big deal to us, but it was the event of him coming back that was a big deal, not actually having him there. Because once he was back again, I don't recall any presence in my life. Through kindergarten, through grade 1, through grade 2, grade 3, grade 2. I don't remember him ever being a part of my life in any way, other than kind of just existing. And all the memories I have of my mom taking us to school and taking my brother to get his glasses and picking us up and stuff like that. I think my father, around the age of 7, 6, would watch wrestling with me on TV. Would sometimes take us to the Winnipeg Arena to see AWA wrestling, which he loved. He would take us to hockey games that he loved. sometimes football games that he loved. Yeah, I think there's a theme there. It was always things he loved. It was never things we wanted to do. I mean, I developed a like for wrestling as a kid because, as a kid. But I don't ever remember bonding with him over any of those things. We were just sort of went together, and like uncle was there or grandpa was there. And I remember and then I took hockey. I think I was around 6. I couldn't even skate. I could barely even stand on them. I think I was 6, and he took me to hockey practice. And there wasn't a lot, but he did take me. So he was involved in my life there. But I never bonded with him over hockey. Most of the time that I recall, games were in community clubs and things that were nearby, and we were generally expected to just get our asses there ourselves. And a lot of times, we carpooled with other families and stuff. I remember as I got to about 9, 10, 11, then there was I think around age 11, I was in a hockey team where there was quite a bit of travel involved because the coaches were very obsessed with it. And they booked games all over the place, and we had like 88 games that year, plus tournaments. It was like 104 games. It was just insanity. And so my poor dad, I give him credit. I remember him getting up at like 4 in the morning. We would drive to like Lac du Bonnet or something for a 5:30 game, get back in the car, then drive to Oakbank for another game, then back in the car and back to Lac du Bonnet for another game, then back to Winnipeg. I remember there was like Saturdays with 3 games, or like a practice, then 2 games. It was like, and he was there for that to the degree that he could be. And I remember camping. That was a thing he liked, was camping. And we never spent any time together camping. Like he would be taking the family camping, and it was kind of like he was on his own little trip, and then a family was coming along, and he was just doing his thing. And most of that was the drinking, right? I remember for all of the trips we ever took, the big thing that was, couldn't stop for anything fun, couldn't stop for anything novel, couldn't stop for the kids to take a break, or go up a hill, or have an adventure, because like we just had to make time. But I remember there was always these scheduled like drinking stops. Well, we're just gonna stop at the rest stop for a little bit. And it was always played off as this rest stop thing, and it was like, what it really was my dad just was so excited, and he always had the cold beer prepared, and it was his thing to just drink. And I remember the kids would just be like so like bored to tears at this rest stop for like an hour while my dad drank beer after beer, because that's when he got happy. Like, he was miserable the whole time, didn't want to stop for anything, didn't want to do anything, but the rest stop was when the beer came out, and then the smile came on, and he was chill in his lawn chair, sitting there with his belly sticking out. And we get to our destination, and I remember for him it was always about complaining about drinking, the price of drinking, the price of ice, the price of soda pop, the price of the parking, the price of the camping spot, the price of the gas, the price of the wood, the price of the convenience store, the price, everything was just, I remember that was just, he largely spoiled things we did like that through just continual nattering and complaining. And I remember my mother just beat the crap out of him. She just wouldn't brook it. Be like, we're fucking spending this money, I'm not going to listen to you bitch all the time. It didn't stop him, but at least it arrested it a little bit. And then when he wasn't grieving, he was drinking. So there was no presence with him on those trips. Like, there was no like doing things with dad. It was, kids were swimming, kids were adventuring, kids were in the lake, kids were playing ball. Dad was sitting there drinking. I remember that. Just by himself all day. and the snoring at night. And I remember there was this, my dad wanted to be a dad. He just didn't try or care enough to try. Like, he didn't know how, and he didn't know how to be a dad. He didn't want to know how to be a dad, but he wanted to pretend to want to know how to be a dad. It was weird. And because I remember there was this one thing around grade 3 or 4, I was super excited about science and like biology and microscopes and stuff like that, and chemistry, and I was just fascinated with that to the limited amount my mind at that age could understand, right? And I remember asking for my birthday for this microscope. And it was a big fight about how it would just be a waste of time and why would I want this stupid microscope and da-da-da. And I couldn't get my parents to understand, like, I'd much rather have this than a toy car, like, which you just drive around in sand. It's just dumb, you know? So finally I convinced them, and then my father was like, yeah, okay, son, we're gonna do this big father-son thing. We're gonna get this microscope, and it's gonna have the little slides that you can put your samples on. We're gonna go down to the ponds, we're gonna go down to the ditches, we're gonna collect samples, and we're gonna put them in the dish things, and we're gonna look at them and see the results, and it's gonna be so exciting. So I got the thing, and I played with it a little bit by myself, but I really just reserved it on the shelf, waiting for that time when me and Dad were gonna go collect samples. And of course, never came. I kept on mentioning it. And I sort of just stopped mentioning it. And then the next year came, and the spring came, and I mentioned it again. And it was always like, oh yeah, son, totally gonna do that. And it just never happened. And it's something I've always carried with me. Because it's poignant because it relates to this thing I know about my father. Like, I don't know very much about my father and his relationship with his father, but this is poignant because I think it relates to his lack of relationship with his father or connection. Like, when my father, throughout this period I've told you about now, the 10 or 12 years there, I know a little bit about my dad and his relationship with his dad. And I know that he really had no relationship until he was, 6, 7, 8, because they would just scrambled their way to Canada. They barely got here. They were living in refugee camps, and other things. But they got here with forged documents, and they were just in survival mode. It was scrambling to live, being completely outcasts. Ukrainians were hated in Winnipeg. Racism, like, couldn't get a job, couldn't get any economic advantage. They were just living, just doing what you could to survive. So there was no connection there. And I think as my father got a little bit older and they stabilized a little bit and they finally got a home they could live in, and my grandfather had built, because he was a carpenter, after years, right, of investing in the family and saving money. I never remember one story of my father and his father prior to when he was about like 10 or 11. And then I remember the one story that he tells about his dad. There's like 2 or 3, but those aren't personal. This is like the one personal story he's ever told me about his relationship with his father. He kind of said his father didn't know how to be a father, was an uneasy father. So he kind of acknowledged that a few times. It never was said beyond that. And the one really sad thing was that he talks about the happiest time he ever had with his father. And in fact, his whole entire youth growing up, the happiest time he ever had was one time he convinced his father to go outside and throw the ball with him. And the father did that and went outside and threw the ball for 15 minutes. And my dad had spoke very unironically and very non-self-aware, like not aware of how poignant and sad that is. We talked so excitedly about how that was the happiest day of his youth with his dad. The one time they played 15 minutes of catch, so like, My dad did a lot better than his dad did, but there were circumstances, right? I shouldn't even put judgment, but and there's like one other story he tells about how they bought his grandfather some chisels and he wouldn't use them because he'd been using these chisels that had been worn down to nubs. So they went out and the family collected money and bought him a collective set of chisels because he was a carpenter for his birthday, so he could stop using these destroyed chisels. And the new chisels stayed in the basement for 2 years and they didn't use them because they were too new. So he suffered with these awful, broken, disgusting, shit chisels for another 2 years until they were worn to nubs. That's the other story. Those are the two stories I know about my grandfather from my father's mouth. No, there's a third story. The moon was evil. The moonlight was evil. And when the moon came out, all the windows shades had to be drawn and you couldn't get moonlight on you, otherwise the evil would get you. And so, okay, so grade 11, now, maybe that hockey year took a lot out of my dad. It was like 100 and God knows how many games, and really credit to my coaches, but I was falling off the rails as a child. I was very mentally ill. My parents' marriage was destroyed. My father's alcoholism was beyond belief and reckoning, just absolutely beyond. Well, rewinding the tape, like I said, I don't know very much about my father, but one of the key stories I remember my mother telling me, it's like she told me without knowing she was telling me, because at the time, I was very young, and I remember her like bragging to me about how smart my father was and how well he was doing in university. But he had to be on heavy sedation, heavy Valium, because his nerves just got beyond. Now, knowing what I know about alcoholism and my father's severe drinking and my family's and all of that, really what I was being told was that my father was already shaking drunk alcoholic while he was in university, to the point that he had to be on severe, like substantial Valium, which is basically alcohol in a pill, right? So he was shaking, drinking like already at presumably 15, 14, 13, 15, 16, right? But now by the time I think I was 10, 11, 12, I started to get into junior high. The marriage was just destroyed. My mother was miserable. My father's drinking was beyond belief. Like there was... And kind of throughout my life, I just have these memories of my dad, none of which are really positive. Most of them are embarrassing. I was always deeply embarrassed by my father and his like completely uncouth, boorish behavior. Total lack of tonsorial care. Personal comportment and deportment quite poor. Which is odd, because he criticized mercilessly if you ever didn't look absolutely perfect, right? You looked like a bum. That was his thing. You look like a bum. If your hairstyle wasn't what he was approved of, you looked like a hippie, a stupid bum, you know. If you had the two nanometers of hair growing out of your follicles, 5 o'clock shadow, you look like a bum. Always look like a bum. Criticism, never building up, never complimenting that. But the funny thing was, he dressed... He dressed so poor, like, so unbelievably poorly. My father didn't value his outward appearance, and he didn't value buying any garments or clothes or anything new. He didn't see that as worthwhile. It was just any old, useless, worn, stained, free, ill-fitting garment he would just wear. They would be covered in stains, like shirts that were like 8 sizes too small, like 4 sizes. I don't know, just stretched to the point they looked like they were spray painted on him, with armpit stains from like years and years of wear, and little pit holes in them. I remember sometimes he had to go on TV when he was a weather forecaster, meteorologist. Every once in a while the spokesman was on vacation or someone otherwise disposed, whatever. And my father would go on TV and he always looked like he just rolled out of the back of a car, like looked like he slept in the backseat of his car. My father had no suits. He had these hand-me-down things that didn't fit, or fit when he was 60 pounds lighter. And he would go on TV and it just looked hideous. And when we go out, he would chew loud with his mouth open, talk, and food would be flying out, and he'd have snot coming out, literally snot coming out of his nose. He wore the same jacket for 20 years. People would mock him. And he'd just be like, oh, haha. And it's like, no, we're mocking you. It's time. I remember that about him. I completely lost touch with him, I think, around the age of 12. I never had any involvement. He had no involvement in my life whatsoever at that point. And neither did my mother. Their marriage was kind of done. My mother was sick of the children. She wanted out of the house, and she took working to be her way out. And my father's drinking was just completely dominated his life. Every free moment of his life now was drinking. Of course, it always was. There was never any leisure activities. I mean, the wrestling and stuff when I was a kid shows that there was enough functionality that he was still leaving the house. But I think by 11, 12, he wasn't leaving the house anymore. He was staying home drinking all the time and just watching wrestling on VHS. I can't think of a single thing where he was involved in my life or anything of any kind from then to about 23. Even then, still none. In my teenage years, I think the one thing my father and I would do so that there wasn't total non-connection, and I think it was largely my mother who screamed at him and made him do it, because he would never leave the house, right, was to take me and to play snooker with me. And so I think every couple months, we'd play snooker. Which was, again, his game. I did like it, and I was very good at it and enjoyed it, but there's a theme. My father didn't know what I liked, didn't care what I liked. And if he does something with you, it's something he likes. Or he doesn't do it. And the things he likes would be like Hooters restaurants, football games. That's it. And there had to be alcohol there. As my drinking career took off, my father and I played a little more snooker. And the thing about my dad was he hated to spend $1. We grew up with almost nothing frivolous. Even we had hardly even clothes. Everything was hand me down. My sports gear was all hand me down. There was infinite money for alcohol. There was never money for that other stuff, right? So I'd found this thing where we could play snooker at the Legion as long as we were members. It was effectively free. Well, then he wanted to play snooker. Then we just wanted to play shitloads of snooker. But it wasn't really about the playing snooker, and it wasn't really about the spending time with me. It was because then he had an excuse to get away from my mother, who would just henpeck and berate and beat him all day and night. And whether that was right or wrong, who knows? I mean, they had a very toxic relationship. So it was his excellent way to get away. And of course, he would sneak alcohol into the Legion. So he wouldn't buy alcohol. I would, because I felt so embarrassed. I'm like, how can we be basically paying our membership only so we can get free use of the snooker table and leaving? Like, that's kind of like grasping and a little bit, you know, exploitative. Like, we should at least give a little back. So we played a lot of snooker. Once a week we would go. And my mother hated it because she knew that it was his excuse just to drink, like get fucking really tuned up. Because anything, she knew how much he drank, and she hated it. And it was, God knows how much. I don't even know. He hit it so well. I'm thinking 60 ounces a day, for sure 40. I believe 60 is closer though. There's infinite money for booze, but not that other stuff. And anyways, so this snooker thing was his way to get away from. This was the point. As long as he drank out, he had these weird rules. Like if he drank at home and someone saw him, then it counted as drinking. But if no one saw him pour the drink, then it didn't count as a drink. And if he had a drink out at my grandfather's, but it was my grandfather's booze, then it wasn't a drink. But if he brought his booze to my grandfather's, then it was a drink. And if he brought his booze to the Legion where no one could like officially say that he drank it because he was behind closed doors and no one knew, then that didn't count as a drink either. So he had all these crazy rules, right? No, I wasn't out. I just playing snooker with Chris and having 10 ounces of rum, right? But so these rules were all, and then it made my mother insane. So she henpecked him to the point where he was told not to take alcohol to the Legion anymore after he got a letter from the Legion saying like, hey, cut it out. He was bringing in Diet Pepsis to fuel his own booze, and they knew it. Right? And so my mother exploded on him. And then he didn't want to play snooker anymore. That's too, snooker went from like 2 hours to, 20 minutes. We could play one game and then, fuck it, I want to leave. Because he just couldn't get home fast enough to get his booze, right? That was it. That's about like much all I know about my father. I mean, I know that what he went through, there's a couple other things I know. These are things I heard from other people. That he was just kind of like a kickabout ragamuffin kid, as with all the other kids in the neighborhood. They were kind of poor. They had nothing to do. And he told me these stories about how he'd go around with the neighborhood kids and they just get into mischief, stealing chickens and eggs and like cooking potatoes in a fire by the railroad tracks. It's just, you can kind of get the picture. There was not a lot of money and they were just trying to wasting time. I remember then he told me he started to work when he was like 13, 14, 15, I guess, in some like general factory. I remember he had a couple of funny stories about that. One was that they brought in like the efficiency people to like watch everybody. And my dad, being a very bright guy, he knew what was happening. So he just worked at a very leisurely, slow pace, and everybody else broke their backs and sweated all day. But all they were doing was establishing what are like what is basic, what is basic output at this factory for each worker? And my father, who just did a reasonable performance, was then getting raises because he was seen to be getting better and better, and everyone else who worked at the maximum all day, were constantly being called on the carpets. Why isn't your productivity higher? Because you're not meeting the baselines. So I never forgot that one. Then I remember telling me another one. He said they would do all kinds of things, like they put shoes in boxes, or they would mix glue and make glue bottles and ship them in boxes to the different hardware stores. So they get one drum of solvent, 2 drums of industrial glue. They'd mix the solvent and the glue in an industrial mixer, and then they have a bottle, pouring machine. They'd fill the bottles. And I remember my father told me that they had different bottles with different labels. It was all the same glue going in the same ones. Just the label was different. One was going to Home Hardware. One was going to Kildonan Hardware. One was Bob Vila's super premium wood bonding agent. Or just make it up. I just made that up. But all different prices. I kind of remember that too. What else do I know about my dad? I remember he played snooker with his cousin Paul. So his cousin Paul was like his brother. But I know nothing about my cousin. I know nothing about their shenanigans or times together. There's no real stories. I just know that they played snooker a little bit. I know that he got a car when he was 16 from working at this factory or something. And he tells this story about how his friends egged him on to do this burnout in front of the school. And they egged him on and egged him on and egged him on. He did this giant burnout. Well, the reason his friends were egging him on was because there was a cop right behind him. He said he didn't even make it a quarter down the block the cherries were on. He pulled over and he got a furious driving charge. Which at the time apparently wasn't as much of a penalty, but he paid the price for that. And his dad was like, and my dad and mom were like, okay, too bad for you, fuckhead. Apparently he did exceptionally well in university, like scoring 99s in like college and university level math and stuff, and like he did all kinds of theoretical physics. Apparently intellectually a great deal of potential. I never knew my father to be very particularly intellectual. I think maybe he had raw computing power or something at that time in his life, but by the time the kids came around, by the time we came around, I think all that was gone or tapped out or sapped from alcohol use, or I don't know. I think he had raw potential to be intellectual, but he was not a very good thinker. Like, he was a very illogical thinker. So I don't know. Maybe when he was on the rails and the books told him, here's the formula, do the things, he knew what to do and could do it to perfection, but he couldn't analyze his way out of a paper bag. He had no logical thinking abilities, no troubleshooting, no big picture thinking. So I don't really know what his intellect level. I kind of always thought he was stupid. I couldn't explain the simplest concepts to him. He was so ignorant and so immune to depositing new information in him. He wasn't interested. So I don't understand. He had no intellectual pursuits, nothing intellectual of any kind. The things he liked was like professional wrestling, going to Hooters. I would remember when he'd take me to football games because he'd get free tickets or something. He would be the guy leering at the cheerleaders with his like binoculars, and he'd be like, I was like, oh. So like, was this man an intellectual? Like, I don't know. But apparently he was bright enough and he got good enough marks that he got scouted by the government. They put him in the meteorology program and trained him and hired him and all of this, because you don't go to school for meteorology. Government of Canada trained him for meteorology with a science background in school, right? So that was that. I just remember drinking. Everything in my father's life was drinking. And yet if you asked him, like, it was this constant baffle gab. Everything was baffle gab about how much he drank. He had bottles hidden everywhere, many different sizes, shapes, sizes, outside, inside, downstairs, and he would never admit that he drank a lot. If you ever asked him how many drinks he had, it was always 2 drinks. It didn't matter if the bottle was down 30 ounces, it was just 2 drinks. If I remember asking him one time, it was so humorous because he was so evasive all the time. Like, I mean, when I was an alcoholic and I drank like a lunatic, I was like, yeah, I drink. I love it. I drink like crazy. Deal with it. I fucking love drinking. I was at least admitting it. Like, as if I should be proud of it, but my father didn't have any of that self-awareness, or he was so deep in denial and felt the need to deny it to people to the point it was just absolutely absurd, right? I asked him one time, so Dad, let me ask you a question. How many times in your life have you been drunk, do you think? And he said, he thought about it, probably 2. Meanwhile, he spent every single day of my life shit-faced. He never fell asleep one time, passed out every time in his chair. So, but that's the kind of drinking alcoholic guy he was. And he wasn't violent drunk or a belligerent drunk. He just was quiet, just went into his shell, into nowhere land. What else? That's about it. That's about all I know about my dad. Oh, apparently he was very badly abused by my grandparents, but I'm not sure about the veracity or extent of the truth there, or what parts are true and which are exaggerated. Allegedly, my mom says they were threatening to throw him out of the house all the time, and like bags are being packed and stuff, and it was very traumatic for him, but something to do with the fact that my mother was German and my dad was basically having sex with this German girl, and they knew that, and having been what they went through in Ukraine and then being slave to Germans, in World War II, they weren't exactly pleased. Plus, they always had their old world ignorant ways anyways of, you gotta marry a nice Ukrainian girl, so they were horrified that my dad was interested in this German girl. So I don't know about that. Yeah, that's all I know about my dad. I'm scratching my mind for other things. There's like so little to say about the man. His eulogy would be like, here's Mike. Mike was born to poor family, refugee immigrants to Canada. Mike's family worked hard and Mike worked hard, and they established themselves here despite great adversity, financially, racially, politically, and otherwise, socially. Ukrainians were not liked at that time, but they got ahead enough to get by. My father put himself through university, scored very well, and in university he met a woman that he married. My father graduated and was trained by the unit government to become a meteorologist, and he served there for 42 years. Mike had 3 kids. In his younger years, he liked camping, but he enjoyed staying around the house more and having fire pits when he was older. Mike has 2 boys and 1 girl, children. Mike likes watching sports on television, eating fatty foods, drinking alcohol and leering at women, and hating minorities, and being a spite-filled ass. And then he got divorced when the children had left the house, when he was around 60-ish. Everything was wrapped up and new grandchildren were on the way. His wife, who never liked him, left him because she was dying of cancer. He remarried a woman who was an enabler, and he rejected the rest of his family and adopted her as his new family. And her family is his new family, even though they didn't like him at all and made fun of him to his face because he was a boorish alcoholic ignoramus. And I don't know why they kept him around, but they never questioned his drinking and they completely, fully enabled it. And so he chose their family over ours, and he basically kicked everyone out of his life, and then he died. And that's my dad. And he died in October, and I don't care. And in fact, I'm a little bit glad he's dead, because he was just a destructive force in everybody's life. He was a very poor excuse of a human being, and a shit father, an absolute garbage father, a wanton narcissistic addict who had a penchant for complete denial of reality, who could not be reasoned with or communicated with, and lived every moment for the sole pursuit of consuming alcohol. All right. I wasn't really sure where any of that was going to go. But yeah. I mean, there's a lot more I could say about my father. But then it gets like, I don't know, I guess in a way, like I don't want to go there where you start to talk about character flaws and judgmental words and things and viewpoints and things. Because it can go into that territory, but I have to acknowledge that to a great degree, I think who I am today was selected specifically and consciously by me growing up as a way of viewing the world, practicing my thought processes intentionally in contrast to the way my father was, trying to take most of the things that my father did as negative teaching, learning by contrast, learning what not to do. In fact, it was everything was, oh my God, yes, he was a horrible craftsman. Everything he tried to fix, he did the worst job. So yeah, everything with him was learning what not to do. So I think so many of the things I am now are directly in rebellion to who my father was. Dressing well is in rebellion to my father. Having this beard is in rebellion to him. Not really, but yes, you know. Loving everybody for who they are and not hating people. Spending $1 when it needs to be spent. Saving $1 when it needs to be saved, not to spite yourself. Being open to new ideas, admitting when you're wrong. Having a scientific mind, understanding you don't always have all the information and that more information can change your viewpoint. Being able to see multiple perspectives at the same time. Thinking women have value as people. Valuing others. Yeah. My father kind of was like an anti-Avatar. He was everything I didn't want to be. And it's too bad that I became him in a lot of ways. I think that's inevitable though, right? All right. Thanks for listening if you did. Probably no one is.